as well.
Yeah, and I'll screen share now. And
okay, still one.
Don't want that. I want something else. So Steve, you should be able to screen share now.
Yeah, okay, I've got it now.
Welcome to the Mkars Club.
Thank you very much. Let me just go to slideshow. Right, okay. So can you all see that and can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs up, Phil.
That's fine.
Right, okay, somebody's not muted. If you can mute everybody, otherwise I get all these scratching noises.
Yeah,
okay.
Yep, I need to
get people to mute, yeah.
Mute all, there you go.
Okay, well, very good. Good.
Oh, no, let me just unmute Steve.
Right, okay, there we go. Yeah, good evening, everybody. Nice to be here. It's a while since I've been up to Milton Keynes. I have met some of you. I've met you before, haven't I, Phil? I think up at up at the club. Right, just a quick word about me, and thanks for that lovely introduction, Phil. It's the best one for a while. No, really nice introduction. Just a bit about me. I was licensed when I was 16 in 1970. One of the youngest to hold a G3 call from when they originally were issued. If you work a younger G3 than me, because it's 51 years now, it's either you really have worked a G3 younger than me, there are a few, or you've worked somebody who's been reissued. There are a few, but not very many G3s calls reissued that I know about. My background is I'm a professional communications engineer. I was trained by the government. I joined the Met Police, which is the subject of my other talk, which has been a long-running talk, and maybe you want that later in the year. I get a lot of requests for that one about police and comms through the ages. I became a fellow of the IET in the 1990s. I've got about 40 HF stations down in the workshop, which I've restored over probably the last 20 years. Now, I'm going to get through quite a lot this evening. It's all heavy technical. It's a bit about the history of stuff. So if I don't mention some people on this call, there are some older operators. If I don't mention your favourite bit of old ham radio kit or old kit, it's not because I've forgotten it. It's because when you look at it, there's so much, I could never fit it all in. My screen share is not working. Stand by one then. Just going to stop sharing for a second and reload my
okay.
Yeah, it's all right. Just going to reload my Open Office. Occasionally, when I start screen sharing, the presentation doesn't run properly. Right, I'll do it this time, and hopefully. Right, can you see that, Phil?
We can't see anything yet.
Okay, hold on. Right, okay. Before I start, a bit of a health warning about restoring and rebuilding old kit. If this is your idea of a perfect shack with an IC76 something or other and a laptop and a microphone, then you might want to look away now, because you might have a bit of a worry that your garage could end up looking like this. You might, if you cringe at piles of old junk, then pop out and make a cup of coffee. In a real worst case, you could find that your wife looks at you like this. Greg's gone to the ham auctions this afternoon to get rid of a load of stuff. But outside the window, of course, Greg's coming back from the ham radio rally with even more stuff than he took there. And if you're in a really bad way, you might end up like W9EVT. Now, W9EVT, I've forgotten his name. His museum of stuff is bigger than my garden, let alone my house. And that's only one of his rooms. So, you know, you are on a slippery road down here if you decide to pick up on anything that I talk about. So I think it was Carl Sagan who said, to understand the present, we've got to go back to the past. So let's just have a quick look back in past times. Pretty much after the First World War, valve technology, which is obviously pretty central to some of the stuff I and a lot of people who deal with old radio kit do play with. Valve technology was pretty well sorted between the wars. It was used in aircraft in the First World War. And that valve was getting pretty well developed by the end of the First World War. But between the wars, up until the outbreak of the war, valve technology, all the stuff about valves and the way they work, thermodynamic tubes, was pretty much worked out, all the different types of triodes, pentodes, tetrodes, the whole science behind them and the physics was pretty well worked out. So by the Second World War, valves were pretty much a pretty mature technology. This is the EF-50. Some say the valve that won the Second World War because it was used in chain home radar. And of course, some of you may know that it was the main production area for it was in Eindhoven in Holland. And we had to quickly evacuate gear and people from Eindhoven in Holland so that it could be made here because it was so central to our war effort. So valve technology moved very quickly between the wars and pretty mature by the outbreak of the Second World War. Well, broadcasting took off in a big way here, a really big way in America, but a big way here as well with 2LO, of course. Most of you would have heard about it. Radio hams initially had quite a free rein on the high frequency bands above 200 meters. Wow, 200 meters. But quickly, as broadcasting started to expand, those useless shortwave frequencies became of interest to broadcasters and other users, and we were compartmentalized pretty much into the bands we know today. Spark transmission, for any of you that are interested, disappeared certainly in ham radio circles pretty much at the around 1922 because there's from an American magazine, there's the valve with its boxing gloves on, just having knocked out a spark transmitter. And 1922 was when radio hams started to successfully transmit across the transatlantic. So pretty much spark was dead from a radio amateur point of view. It did carry on, surprisingly, for a little while afterwards. One thing that I did start to work out pretty early on in putting this presentation together last year was that in this country, off-the-shelf ham radio kit was not particularly, there wasn't particularly much available in the 30s. There was more in the US, which we'll come on to, but not a great deal in the 30s. So pretty much before 1935, if you were a radio ham, I think it was probably you might have ended up dressing like Gerald Marqueu's G2NM. Of course, you know, that's the dress code that we should all be using when we're chatting away on any band. I, of course, dress up like that when I talk to Dave, G3ZPS on 80 meters. So I have done on and off for many years now. So there he is, Gerald Marqueu's. Looking into the 30s UK hams, if we look at this advert from the mid-1930s, this is from a ham radio supplier near me, well, where I used to live with my parents when I first got G3ZPS in Bromley. And you look at all the receivers down there, and there's something particular about them. That's the Hallicrafter's Sky Buddy. This is a radio that Dave ZPA will, of course, know and love, the RME 69. There it is, 38 pounds. But of course, they're made in the US. In fact, everything, just about, I think everything made on that, you know, stock of receivers on the left there, they're all American. And there were questions asked in the first shortwave mags, which I think came out in 1937, why there weren't any British companies, or not many, very few, making ham radio communications gear. And the reality was, for whatever reason, I can't really find a single reason, we were pretty slow off the mark. You know, was it the market? Was it the likely cost of the R&D? Remember that sort of money, 38 quid, some of them are cheaper, of course, but a good receiver at 38 quid. That was probably twice, 2 times a monthly wage back then. Of course, the Brits did start eventually. Eddystone, which had been around since the 30s and been making little regen receivers and very simple 2-valve or 3-valve receivers, started to get in on the act, and they made this the ECR, the Eddystone communication receiver. But you look at the price, 45 quid. Now that is more than 2 months' salary for the average, and if you're a lower paid worker, it could be even more than that. And not many transmitters either, very few transmitters in the 30s. There were a few, again, if you go through the old shortwave mags, but America was in a completely different place. So, of course, the world started to change, and it changed out of all recognition from just about everything, really, but we're talking about communications. In the Second World War, the war that really radio was now a critical part of the war machine, and all the armed forces scrabbled to document their communication needs, and where they perhaps hadn't really thought about it much before the war. The three main forces all started to realise that they had different requirements, and the whole R&D and manufacturing industry swung into action. There's the Army, which had specific requirements, the Navy, which had specific requirements, and the Air Force, which had specific requirements. So, of course, what happened is the radio requirements and needs were quite different. And the production, just in the Allied powers, but the Axis powers, swung into a massive overdrive for the technology, which was so central to the war effort. And there was a very large production and diversity of equipment. So that's really where our story of some of the kit that some of us play with starts. And I'll say it several times, but the sheer volume globally of gear that was made in this period, and perhaps the Brits could have been a bit quicker off the mark, as I said in the previous slide. But the sheer amount of stuff is pretty breathtaking. And of course, without going into a great deal about everything that happened in the Second World War and in the comms area, immediately after the war, that kit gradually wasn't for the disuse, but it was no longer required at the volume that it was, and also the pace of R&D meant some of it went out of date pretty quickly. So where did it go? Of course, it came to us as surplus, and it really was a surplus. I was going to say, I said there was a surplus explosion, and a trickle turned into a torrent from the late 40s through to the late 60s. Again, there was just so much stuff. And we could get hold of some great gear to restore and play with, and now we're restoring it. At the time it became available, then it was still pretty new, 20 years old, and still working pretty well off the shelf. And that brought with it a phrase which I have managed to find, I think, the derivation of, which is this phrase, the boat anchor. And there's a receiver, many of you will recognise, the AR-88, we'll come on to that in a minute, holding a small boat down. And I wonder where this phrase boat anchor came from, because it's sort of run through all my restoration work and all my researches, and many of you older operators who've got call signs that have been around for a bit will know the term boat anchor. There it is. I weigh 100 pounds, probably would easily hold my fishing boat down. I don't have a fishing boat. But I found out the earliest mention I can find of it is in CQ magazine. And there it is, 1956. I thought a rather cutting reply, actually, to whoever it was who wrote to them. A reader asked about converting wartime gear to amateur use. That's a real cutting reply, that, isn't it? You know, really not very, thought they would have been a bit more reasonable than that. here at CQ, the only thing we have on file is the 100 feet of 1-inch manila line, on the end of which is tied securely around the radio. This then converts the unit into a fine anchor for a small boat. I thought, blimey, that's a bit direct, isn't it? But anyway, that's the earliest derivation. If you know any more, if you know where it came from, any earlier on that, but that's documented. If you go and look for CQ magazine on the internet, then you'll find that quote. I've just squeezed it down a little bit for dramatic interest, but that's pretty much what it says. So what was all this kit that started to appear? Well, if we go through it in sequence, the very first one I show will be familiar to some of you, very familiar to some of you, and probably some of you would have seen pictures of it. But probably the most famous, it's the 19 set, which became a real popular with hams of my generation in the 60s to use on, they could get it on 160, cover 80, and even up to 40 meters. Started production in 1940, quickly went through Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, up to 1942. Huge numbers made, absolutely massive amount. Used into the 50s and used for cadets, army cadet training into the 70s. And now there's a big collector community who are quite keen, and it's really pushed the prices of these up. It's a World War II bit of kit, so it's perhaps not quite as easy to work on and restore as some of the kit that comes that we're going to talk about later. Now, I have had a 19 set in the past because everybody of my ham generation had one, but I haven't got one now. I'm not sure I would have one now. Again, you could just go on websites and look up the amount of kit. That's a 62 set, which is similar to a 19 set. In many ways, lower power, only 1 watt. The 19 sets between 2 and 9 watts. You can put an amplifier on it and get more power out of it. And it's got quite an interesting AM modulation technique, which again, Dave ZPA knows about. And but they sound reasonable. There's another little set here, the 18 set, only 250 milliwatts. Love to get hold of one of them, but they've become very, very collectible. And really, there's a whole presentation just about this one group. Before we talk about anything else, and there isn't time for it, there's a whole presentation on just army kit from around the war and anything that came later. And if you want to get the VMARS, which is up there in the top left, Vintage Military Amateur Radio Society, they can probably get you a speaker if you really want to go into a lot of detail about this kit. So, you know, my generation of hams, you could buy a 19 set, not quite pocket money. You had to beg your parents to, just go back one to that. You had to beg your parents possibly to get some cash, but you could look down there and this is John's radio in Bradford. What does it say there? £4.10 shillings. Every set supplied brand new in a carton, £4.10 shillings. So, you know, less than a fiver back then. These days they can fetch in good condition, really good condition, because a lot of them have been beaten up and modified, and that's what we did back then, wasn't it? We modified them and we took bits out, and we took the VHF set out and played around with them, and now they can fetch many hundreds of pounds if they're in reasonable condition. And vintage vehicle people quite like them, even if they're not working, to have in their World War II vehicles if they were appropriate. So this leads on to this green radio lark, and green radio, which is a generic name for loads of the kit pretty much that came after into the 50s, with Larkspur, then Klansman, which was familiar to me, then Bowman, and the next one in the future is going to be called Morpheus, apparently. Klansman was what I played with when I was in the MOD in the 70s, because it was the current sort of kit. And green radio, again, has become a subgenre of all this vintage kit all by itself. So, and there are some people who absolutely love it. Restoring and rebuilding it is harder than some of the kit we'll talk about later, because it's weatherproof, it's sealed, the modules are hard to get at. But there are dedicated individuals who will pull a lot of this kit apart. Some doesn't need to be if it's the Klansman, some of it, but there is just a huge Raycore and other. There is a huge diversity of this green radio kit. We come on to the Navy, and what did they have? Some of the stuff that came on the market. Well, initially, just around the time of the war, the most popular one, still a popular restoration piece, is the CR100 stroke B28, fairly agricultural looking receiver, square grey box with a few knobs on the front, mainly in use by the military, not entirely. Again, available on the surplus market to us kids of the 60s at a relatively cheap rate, and these days not tremendously difficult to restore. But one thing I'll say about a lot of the things that are in the next few slides, the big thing about them for me, about restoring them, is they're bloody heavy. And that means you're constantly turning things up. You've got to take a lot of heavyweight components out. So these things are perhaps some more specialist restorers, and not just tinkerers and lightweight restorers that we will cover in a few slides time. So there it is, the CR100 receiver, just the and the next one is really a real heavyweight boat anchor, the Admiralty B40 from about 1949, made by a company called Murphy, some of you might be familiar with. Weight not an issue on a ship, of course, and this is a real heavyweight bit of kit. Very, very well made, very heavy. There are some real specialists around the world who love this, but again, it's not for the faint heart when it comes to restoration. And not cheap actually to buy back in the day in the 60s. It must have been either highly regarded, or the surplus sales shops that bought it must have actually paid a bit of a premium compared to the 19 sets and some of the others, because it was 22 shillings and 10 bob, or £22.50, or the LF version, £17.10, but I think it says 15 kilohertz to 700 kilohertz, so it didn't really cover any useful bands for radio hams. But I certainly worked one or two of my mates locally to me in Bromley in the early 70s who had managed to con their parents out of 22 quid. The thing about all these radios, and the next couple we talked to, is they were very good performers on CW, which is what us kids were using back then. And if you want a good analog CW receiver now, then all of this kit's not too bad for it, and pretty good on AM. Very good in AM, because that's what they were designed for. We'll come on to SSB a bit later. So not that cheap on the surplus market. In the Air Force States, well, there's one receiver that probably stands out for anybody of my generation, and that's the R1155, absolutely classic receiver, 80,000 made, in excess of, and came on the surplus market as early as 1947, and then carried on being drip fed. It might have been more than a drip feed, into the 60s, and maybe even into the 70s. So loads of us cut our teeth on the 1155. Again, it had a DF unit that plugged into the front, which a lot of people removed, and cheap and relatively easy, not too heavy, because it was used on aircraft where weight was a bit more of an issue, to keep it light than on a boat. And it goes with its companion transmitter up there, the T1154 at the top. And even those coloured knobs on eBay, for some daft reason, probably because they look good, they fetch a fortune now. But again, this is fairly specialist military equipment for anybody that's going to restore anything, and probably not something anybody would pick up as a first resort. Again, in relatively good condition. They're going to be fairly expensive now, and if they're really beaten up, then you're in for an awful lot of restoration work. Not tremendously complicated, your au fait with valves, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, but the cheap ones are going to be beaten up. So there's the 1154 and the 1155. Coming across the pond from the US with Collins and others, but these things called command sets, and they were in my youth quite popular. Transmitters and receivers is just one example of them. Fairly lightweight and simple, and covered the LF bands, so your top band 80 meters. And again, made in extremely large numbers, because unlike the UK's industrial capacity, which was gearing up in the Second World War, the Americans' industrial capacity was on a whole nother level, and they just went into overdrive. This is an interesting picture from, I'm not sure what, it might be a B-29, I can't remember what this one is, but you look at what the flight engineers got to deal with in the comms. So imagine all those American bombers in all the theatres of war, and they all got a tremendous amount of kit in. You look at the command receivers for short range comms up the top there, up here. You've got a BC348 receiver here in the middle. You've got a 1936 Ford ashtray here. I'm not quite sure why it's important, but in this photograph it is. There it is. You've got what's not familiar to everybody, but this bit of kit down the bottom here is the ART-13. It's a Collins transmitter. Ran well into the 60s and the 70s. Absolutely phenomenal bit of kit, 813 valve in it, specialist for restoration because it's built with ultra reliability in mind. And it's got a very innovative thing called an automatic tuning arrangement in it, which I think you could select a frequency with a VFO and then go back to that frequency and it will reset to that frequency, which was a real innovation because you didn't need thousands of crystals, but yet it had the resetability of having a crystal. But boy, I bet the military paid for that. So you just look at the amount of kit here. This is a flight engineer, geez, amount of stuff. Antenna tuner here in the middle for his ART-13. And imagine that replicated tens of thousands of times over, and you can see why so much surplus kit came onto the market. It's almost certain that the ART-13 was on the Enola Gay, of course, and all that other kit, which dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. So after the war, even more, and during the war, sorry, even more stuff started to pop out, which would find its way into radio hams, shacks. For me, possibly my personal most favourite is the classic RCA AR-88. Came out of the industrial capacity to produce stuff in the US. Came from an earlier receiver called the AR-77, which looks a bit similar. But for me, the classic boat anchor. I've got one in my shed. I've had two of them in my ham radio life so far. And there you are, from 1941 to 1951. Amazing mechanical and electrical performance, 25,000 made, estimated. The true number is probably never known. Fantastic gearbox with backlash, anti-backlash spring dials, which you spin it and the dial just whizzes forward. And as a kid, this was the most amazing thing for me. Great on CW. I had one with a crystal phasing filter in it. I think it was a very simple mod. And when I was working my top band DX, I felt I could hear the electrons bouncing off the aerial. It was, my hearing was better than when I was 18, but just the most amazing receiver. And you can see why we brought so many of them into what Dave and me have spoken about many times is the Y listening stations and other listening stations during the war. And some of the listening stations, the one near me in Knockholt, I've got some pictures of it. It's got racks of them. And of course, Dave and his computer museum up there next door to Bletchley Park, not far from where you all are. Of course, he's got racks of AR-88s there as well. Again, the big thing about restoring these radios for me is the damn weight. All the circuits are available. They're not particularly complicated valve radios, but there are some things to be aware of. Most of the wiring in my two have all got the same colour. So tracing what wires go where has become extremely difficult. And there are some capacitors in here which probably contain some hazardous chemicals that shouldn't be drilled into, and they're very hard to get out anyway. The thing is built like a brick outbuilding. It's just a most staggering receiver. And again, on CW and AM, CW specifically, I don't think I had a better receiver in my ham radio youth. I've got one now. Not the easiest thing to repair, again, because of the weight. Of course, one that's familiar to Dave as well is probably the next most famous one, again, out of the US, of course it would do, is the National HRO. Went through all different, quite a few different design variants. This is pretty much a classic one with plug-in coils, which you have to read off with the graphs on the front. One or two of my friends love these on AM. I think they are absolutely staggering receivers on AM. Again, not particularly complicated radio, but need a lot of care and attention in alignment if it's going to work as well as it did. It's a precision-made piece of kit. So quite popular, very popular in the US. Those. There we are, National HRO core pack per band. Even more government listening stations and spies. Yes, couldn't leave this bit of the presentation without talking about the fabulous RA-17 from about 1954-55. Rakel was formed in 1950. It's Ray and Cal formed it. And they managed to land a contract to build receivers for the Navy in this country using Collins. But Collins insisted on using American components, and they visited the Rakel factory, and it was in Isleworth, and it looked a bit of a tip, and they didn't want their receivers made there. So Rakel had to go back to the drawing board, and they fell in with this guy called Trevor Wadley, who had this design called the Barlow-Wadley loop, which if you've got an FRG7, is that technology, a great drift reduction, which I won't go into, there's not time. But they picked up on this and engineered this fabulous receiver, the RA-17, very stable, popular with government departments. Lots of them have come onto the ham markets. Really a handful to restore and rebuild. Again, it's heavyweight. The modules are all screened and sealed, full of nasty capacitors, and not nasty in the health and safety sense, but ones that are prone to failure. But there are some specialist restorers who really do go for these. Rakel kept going, upgrading and upgrading, bringing out newer and newer ones, transistor ones, went right through to the 90s with some fabulous kits before the company got broken up and is now split up in a number of companies. But it's a classic receiver, and quite a few hams I know have got these. There is the RA-17. Cost as much as cost pound lots, yeah, probably as much as a small house back then, because of the market to the military and to listening stations. One of the most fixed, the slide rule dial, there it is, film strip dial, 6 feet per megahertz. This is one of the most famous picture of RA-17s. When I give this picture in public, I ask where it is, what listening station it is, and some people know and some people don't. It's from Dr. No. And apparently it's just the front panels. So after the war, ham radio, specialist ham radio companies started to appear in bigger numbers. One of the first in the US was Arthur Collins, W0CXX. He started to look again at the ham market. He'd been involved in the 30s, a massive producer of military kit in the war. But after the war, things started to fall away, and he started to think about ham radio kit straight after the war. He was straight into thinking about ham radio kit, specialist for the American market. And he started to bring out a line of receivers, 75 series, and some big old transmitters. And he prided himself on super high quality, very stable. VFO, variable frequency oscillator, became a thing called the PTO, permeability tuned oscillator, which is where you have a coil with a core that moves up inside it, much more stability, able to get an accurate readout. And he really, I think he trademarked the term PTO, which we'll come to in a minute. Very stable, accurate readout. But not many turned up in the UK. This is his 1 kilowatt AM transmitter from the late 40s. I remember one about the 1955, Collins embraced SSB. SSB was the future. It was going to be the future, not only for ham radio, but he thought the SSB is going to be the future for HF comms. And he demonstrated it to the US Air Force, Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command, and showed that SSB was much more, much favourable to AM, and Curtis LeMay picked up on this, and Collins were back supplying to the military. But he also saw that SSB was going to be the thing for ham radio. He was visionary, and he saw that HF ham radio AM was going to die out. So they were a bit of a game changer, Collins. They're sort of classic radios. These are their two classics, known in some ham circles as the Gold Dust Twins. It's a 75A4 receiver on the left and the KWS-1 transmitter on the right. In fact, the transmitter on the right has got a cabinet that goes with it, not in this picture. And the cabinet has got the power supply in it, and you know it wouldn't fit in many British ham jacks. Fantastic gear. A Collins employee in 1955-56, he had a bit of an idea. He had these two bits of kit in his basement, apparently, in 1957, and he had this idea. He came up with an idea. He thought, well, both of these bits of kit have got a VFO or a PTO in them. Both of them have got a BFO or a carrier oscillator in them for sideband, or could have. Both of them have got crystals to set the band that you work on. So why not just put those into one box? Why double them up? And of course, he came up with this, which is a KWM1, of which there is one in the radio centre in Bletchley Park, I think, the RSGB centre. Came up with this KWM1, pretty much the first SSB transceiver, and Art Collins picked up on it immediately, and it went into production because it's smaller and lighter, one knob tuning. Could even use it mobile. There it is. Don't think it would fit in Ford Anglia back in the 50s, but maybe in the big American cars it was okay. And it's almost certain, reported that there was one on Gary Powers' spy plane when he was shot down over the US. I would have thought it was a bit heavy to have in a spy plane, but you know, I don't think anybody's going to tell me. I'm going to get the true story. But there's a rumor that the KWM on the sideband transceiver was on Gary Powers' plane. And then Collins really got going. Now we got on some kit now. And again, Dave knows this bit of kit, the KWM2 SSB transceiver. And quickly, from 1959, now we're moving into some real super duper ham radio kit. 30,000 of them made, apparently, became pretty much a benchmark for SSB transceivers. Professional quality, used in the military and amateur, expensive, and pretty soon Collins realised that they were in their market in the US. They could open this out, and it became a whole range of gear. That's inside a Collins KWM, KWM2A, 2 or 2A stands for amateur, phenomenally engineered HF SSB transceiver, and quickly Collins realised they could expand it into a whole line, which they call the S line, classic receivers and transmitters. There is a whole range, too much to ask about. Super documentation, very desirable and highly collectible and expensive. The biggest drawback to owning Collins equipment now, especially in the UK, is availability and price. It's expensive kit. If you just need a knob or part of the mechanics for any bit of Collins gear, you will pay a premium price unless you already have it or you know somebody who's prepared to let you have it cheap. So in terms of restoration of classic amateur radio gear, Collins is really the drawback. There is the price and getting hold of parts. I mean, it is super kit. It's not particularly complicated kit in terms of transceivers, valve transceivers at the time, and the documentation is brilliant. But price and parts and availability in the UK, in America, it's got a huge following. You'll find complete stations of Collins kit. A lot of it is 115 volts as well. You see receivers advertised in the UK and they're 115 volts. Oh, and I couldn't get by without a film. So there's Doris Day in a film called The Glass Bottom Boat. It's a spy film. Can't remember the story. She's got some Collins kit in the picture there. So the next manufacturer, one that's pretty dear to my heart that came along is there's Drake. Robert Drake, there he is, WHCYE. He was a bit like Art Collins, a little bit behind, just a little bit behind. And he saw also his fortunes had faded after the war in a bigger way than Collins had, because he didn't really have a great deal of work for the military. And he was in a real pickle with his company and he thought it would go under. And it really forced him to go back to thinking about ham radio gear. And he saw SSB as the future and decided to design a lowish cost receiver. But he didn't want to build it. He didn't want to have a Drake company building it. He didn't mind building small things, but filters and stuff like that. But it was really do or die. Either have your company or it will go under. And there was, and nobody wanted it. The big American electronics hams companies didn't want to know him. So build it yourself was his. So we did, and this is it, the Drake 1A. It's one of the earliest, cheaper, all SSB only receivers. Once he demonstrated it at a few ham radio outlets in the US, they saw its potential, and he just built up the company from there. And Drake became a big ham radio player, and quickly moved to what's become a classic. Again, I can't show all the bits of this. Classic line of equipment. The Drake transceiver, the TR3 led to the TR4 and a whole range. There it is. I've got 4 of those. I've rebuilt 4 of these radios. And again, PTO, very stable. Compact, good SSB performance even now. Used an innovation called sweep tubes, which are American, mainly American at the time, although made around the world. TV line output tubes, which some bright spark discovered could actually work at HF. They gobble up loads of current and will produce quite a lot of power, not necessarily for a long period if you tune them up for too long, but they were cheap. I think 10, 20 cents each for Drake in bulk. So the ideal transmitting tube for him, he realised that he could make them work, and they weren't the only company that did that. But uses a stable PTO. USA stuff's expensive in the UK, but not as expensive as Collins. Cheaper than Collins though. This is my part of my setup. This is my B line. So this is a separate transmitter and a separate receiver. These are not tremendously expensive to buy in the UK, but they are getting more expensive than when I started 20 years ago. And the lockdown seems to have put the price up. Everybody seems to think they want to buy up old stuff that might be collectible in the future. The big drawback to any of the Collins kit now is these sweep tube valves. You can convert them to use other Chinese RF valves, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you're going to keep it original, these valves, unfortunately, have become the Achilles heel. Cheap at the time, colour TVs went transistorised, and from about 1980, those valves weren't made anymore. So it's 40 years now since they've been made. Unfortunately, like other companies, they rested on their reputation rather too long and didn't innovate and stuck with this broadly similar technology. Their classic R4 C line I've got here right now. I've been using it today. Not particularly difficult to restore, quite compact, so quite tight to maneuver into. And they found some pretty good operators to advertise their product. Most of you will probably know this is JY1. King Hussein, he's got a Drake line there. He had the later 7 line, which I'm not really talking about in this presentation, which is more almost fully, well, it is fully transistorized, but there's JY1 with his Drake 4 line. And we come on to a company which I know and love very, very well because it's very dear to my heart. Started by this gentleman, Rowley Shears, G8KW, who had a very distinguished wartime career, which I've told Dave a little bit about. I sent some stuff to Dave, not time to talk about it here, but he had a very interesting wartime career. And after the war, he did a lot for German operators in a war-ravaged country to get them back on the air, and they made him DRC member #1. He partnered with this guy, Ken Ellis, G5KW. Some of you might remember him. He's big on 6 meters. Interesting gentleman. Oh, there we are, DARC #1. Ken got the Royal Rose and the Dagger from Saudi Arabia in 1950. He did something clever in comms for the Saudi royal family, and they awarded him this honour. The two guys got together really in 1956, just up the road from me here. It is 1956. We've just gone past the 65th anniversary. And they formed a ham radio company for the UK because they looked and saw loads of American kit, but hey, what about the UK? It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And they started building kits. Initially, it was only small things, but they quickly moved on. I think a lot of these designs came from an Italian company called Geloso, but you know, copying's a form of flattery, isn't it? So they started quickly to produce these bits in the boat anchor style. Initially, they were accessories and stuff made in Rowley's shed. They really got going quickly through the 50s, quickly moved on. Stuck with AM initially, that's KW Vanguard on the left, KW 77 on the right, I've 2 of those. Big stuff as well. Boat anchor heavy. This is a KW Viceroy SSB transmitter. Just been looking at mine today. You could get 2 transmitters in that box. It's more air than transmitter. But anyway, they started to produce this stuff relatively cheaply for us here in the home market. Boat anchor design. But Rowley as well, his small team saw the light in 1963, and the team must have sat around to look at the Collins KWM2. I'm still in contact with people who work for the team, but the people who were alive back then who were involved, sadly not many of them around anymore. And he came up with this thing called Project 2000. This is an original prototype picture because the company is near me where I live now, and the photographer is near me. And we went to the photographer about 6 or 7 years ago, and he allowed us access to his archives for that year. And we found the publicity photographs that these probably went to the Horticultural Hall's exhibition of ham radio kit. And this was the prototype for mid-1963. Rowley had it professionally photographed. So it's a circuit topology very close to the Collins KWM2. In fact, it's exactly the same topology, but it's not made the same. It's made cut price, cheaper, in a shed here in Dartford, not at Collins, way cheaper. So it's got no CW filter. It's got no AM capability. It's got a very poor dial readout. It's got a VFO. They couldn't have a PTO. I don't think Collins had trademarked it. Not that they could have built it anyway. And it's got this thing called a mechanical filter, not one that was in a Collins, but it's made by a Japanese company called Kokusai. There it is. We'll come back to it a bit later in a couple of slides' time. And they came up with this real innovation as well on the front end. I won't bore you with it, but they decided they didn't want a load of coils at the front end of the radio and at the transmitter as well. So basically, they put one front end coil in for 80 meters. There it is. And they padded it out for 160 with a big capacitor. There it is. And all they did to go on the HF bands was they shunted the secondary, which is, there's my pointer there here. They just shunted this with a load of other coils. So this bit, the link coupling here, which would have been should have been proper for every band. And if you're very astute, some of you will probably know this, these 1, 2, 3, 4 coils are all in series. So if you align them out of order, you affect the next one up. So boy be tired anybody that twiddles them in the wrong order, you muck up other bands as well. So they're a real pain to align. And they discovered that you could wind the HF band coil straight into a ferrite slug. So you did away with the coil former and the can, which means you have to have nail varnish remover and then nail varnish to put it back. So everything was cut price. But having said that, of course, it worked, and they had a real winner, really, from 1964 to 1976. This is my KW2000B, which came out in about 1969, a classic British SSB transceiver, 200 kilohertz segments, reasonable prices, great customer service. A lot was sold here. They even managed to copy another radio from Swan in America, and they called it the KW Atlanta. I don't know how they got away with it. Restoring KW kit is not particularly difficult. It's quite simple. The parts are readily available. They didn't use particularly good quality components. They tended to use nasty capacitors. We've got a picture of them at the end. And the resistors they used were not particularly good quality either, and they all tend to fail. But not a tremendously complicated radio to rebuild. Good performance, pretty good. Look nice. Does it look a bit like a Collins? Yeah, it does. It's a G line, not an S line. In fact, you can hardly tell the difference in the case. Those sweeps used there, they use 6146 output valves, which are still made in China. Maybe not quite the quality standard they were. And they had 160 meters, which the Collins didn't have, and RIT. So you needed that because the VFO wasn't that stable. So you needed to be able to RIT or clarifier. And way cheaper than US gear. So for a while, KW were a big thing in this country, made a mile from me. That's the factory there. You can see the antennas. I used to go there with my friend Paul, G4BXT. Sadly, a silent key now. There's the sign. And he lived in a house behind here. I didn't live in this area then, but when I used to go and see him as a kid, we'd both go up to see Rowley, and they were very good to us kids. They knew we were hams. They knew we had no money, but they let us in. And some of the guys who are older now remember us going in there because we used to go in every Saturday, get a free cup of tea. And KW quickly expanded like Collins did. KW 2000A, which is an early one. Linears have endured, loads of them. Vespa transmitter, loads of people had those. As a receiver, KW 201. I've got all of this gear. I've got nearly all of this SSB gear, and I've rebuilt it all. And there's that Kokusai mechanical filter, which is a real nasty thing. And that's what happens to it. There's the mechanical filter. There's the bit in the middle here. This is the Achilles heel of KW. Every bit of gear's got an Achilles heel, and for KW, it's this filter. This is a little spline. Looks like a little spine, doesn't it? With a transducer at each end, and it vibrates and gives you a filter pass band, which is all very good. But the foam they wrapped it in the 60s turns to this nasty brown goo, and it gets all over your fingers. You needed meths. And when you put it back together, will it work as well as it did? It's their Achilles heel. KW is this filter. It can be replaced with other filters, but they've all got quite expensive now. And when they're working, these filters, they're very, very good. Not ESSB guys on 80 meters. These are 2.1 kilohertz at 6 dB. I've got quite a good shape factor. So that's their. If you ever come to restore a bit of KW kit, don't turn it upside down too often because the element will rattle. It never did, but now the foam has gone, it rattles around and breaks the wires. They can be repaired, but it's more like repairing jewellery than working with electronics. And they tended to use these nasty Hunts capacitors, which the TV repair guys of the 60s hated. And if you ever see them in a bit of gear, they've all got to go everywhere, even where you can't see them. They're going to be there lurking. This is, we run down here in Cray Valley, we run a special event station every year using GB8 KW. Some of you might have worked as my friend Guy had to run it from his house this year. That gentleman there is Richard Shears, who is Rowley Shears' son. He's now retired. I remember him as a kid. And he holds his dad's call sign G8KW, and there he's using some of our kit last year. 20, was it last year? Yes, it was last year. We did run it last year. So there he is. And just an honourable mention from some other bits of kit from the same period. It was quite popular with Restorer. Sydney Stone really started to make loads of kit in the 50s, and they were famous for their fabulous slide rule dial. KW used it as well in their some of their radios, the Viceroy's. But the fabulous slide rule dial, a very large range of receivers, which was the death of them really. Their R&D department produced so many different variants for different markets mainly in the commercial market. But they never seemed to make enough to make a big profit, and they were always seemed to be ultimately too many short-run products, and the rest of the world overtook them. But they did make some great stuff back in that period. It's not particularly difficult to restore. If it's in reasonable condition, it's well built. One thing to look out for is that some of it was live chassis. I've got an Eddystone 870 which was used on cruise ships, and it's live chassis. Quite a few of their receivers were live chassis, and that means there's no mains transformer in there. So the metal case is insulated from the outside of the radio, which is all well and good, but if you're going to work on it, you need to be careful. This is a EA12, I think, which is some handband only receiver that they made, highly desirable. Again, problems with getting hold of this kit are its rarity and its price. And that's nice flyable digest every amateur band, fantastic. And this little EC10 transistor radio was popular with loads of hams with 2-meter converters back in the day. Oh, there we are, another film clip. That's Dr. No again, earlier in Dr. No than the last one I showed you. That's a KW Vanguard and an Eddystone receiver over there on the right. If you zoom in on that picture, they've got the KW Vanguard in the film. It's in the spy office in Jamaica. It's running on 20 meters, poor choice. Cubby broccoli, should have used 20 meters, mate. Anyway, that's where it is. So it's out of Dr. No again. Of course, I couldn't leave this without talking about Kodar 85. Again, Dave's got one of these. I know I've got a couple of them. Classic little AM transmitter for top band and 18. Really simple project for anybody starting out in valve restorations. The only downside is these become incredibly collectible. They're really simple. People are paying an arm and a leg for them. Goes with a companion receiver, which is pants, really, called the T28. Kodar were made down on the south coast and made all sorts of bits and bobs. It's pretty much of a huge string operation, but they hit the jackpot with this, mainly for mobile, because it's got no power supply built in. So it's really lightweight, little 6 or 8 watts output, stick it in your car with a receiver, and you can operate top band mobile. One of my mates is going to operate top band mobile with this complete setup and try and work me with the same setup. So I have all the parts to do it. So the kit revolution came along as well. Some of us might have worked on this kit. Heath kit was the biggest one by far here, a big outfit. If you can believe the amount of stuff that Heath kit made, in they made a kit for it in the 60s and the 70s, massive 50s, 60s and early 70s. This is their Benton Harbor, I think it is, in the US. Look at it, it's fantastic. It's like the Amazon of the day, isn't it? It's enormous. Here they were based in Gloucester, called Daystrom, some of you might remember. They got on a ham radio in a big way, as well as just about every other area of home electronics you can imagine. Their ham radio kit was Sugar Baker and Hot Water, it became known as SB and HW. Again, I bought some of this stuff off of Dave, ZPA, pretty cheap. And the documentation was amazing. That was the thing about it. And they said it will always work, and great value. This is one of their early transmitters, DX100, big bow tanker thing. But again, just like all the other companies, they spotted SSB was the thing of the future, so they quickly moved in. This is the SB102, that's my one, Sugar Baker 102. The Americans called it the Poor Man Collins. Actually, KW was the Poor Man's Collins, but they didn't have me in America. The thing about the Heathkit gear is, if you buy it, Hot Water 101, got one of those from Dave. I think I got 2 from you, Dave. HW 101, very simple, quite cheap, 120, 130 quid back in the day. The thing about all of Heathkit gear, different to some of the KW's documentation wasn't good, is this fantastic documentation that every wire, every nut, every bolt. So building it and restoring it is fairly easy. The documentation is pretty good. The problem with it is you're fighting 2 things when you rebuild this kit. You're fighting the original design, which was perhaps not the best in the world, but it had to be made into a kit. And the other thing you're fighting is whoever made it, because you will buy something that's already made. So you're fighting the original design and whoever actually built it, and their quality of construction might not have been at the highest level. Again, it's becoming collectible, but I know some idiots who will take the book, the Heathkit book, they will go to the back and they will undo the radio they've got in front of them from the back to the front. So the whole thing is taken apart. Then they will rebuild it from the front to the back using new components. Heathkit in the UK use crap resistors, and they will just fail upon fail upon fail. But most of the rest of the circuit is pretty reasonable, and all the ones I've got work to a reasonable extent, some of them very, very well. So we're getting to the last little bit here. I'm just checking on the time. Heathkit's demise came when it was cheaper to buy something than build a kit, and the whole company disappeared. It tried to get into computers and everything else. But interesting history to the company, which we haven't got time. So just a quick pause for thought here as we're into the swinging 60s and coming out of it. There's some honourable companies here that I just haven't had time to mention, and there are others. Swan, a big American company, Tom Withers, TW Communications. I've got a radio that Tom had. I was in contact with Tom for a few years. Sadly, he's passed away now. TW and KW, Hallicrafters and Hamelin, and there are others, Redifon and others, but there isn't time. But things were changing towards the end of the 70s, end of the 60s, and they changed perhaps quicker than some saw coming. This guy was one of the first in Sarco JA1MP. If you've ever had a 1000 MP, or maybe some of you have got an FTDX 101 MP, then MP it was added to the FT 1000 in 1993 when Sarco died. It doesn't mean anything other than it was in honor of the founder. They put MP on the edge. When you get an FT 1000 MP, it's because of Sarco. He died in 1993. In many ways, he was similar to KW and Drake, and he made a fairly unremarkable kit in the 60s, and not many people took notice, really. But the thing is that with Sarco and Yaesu from 1959, is he started small, but grew very, very quickly. And it wasn't long before he came out with this iconic Fox Tango branding, which continues to this day. And the thing about Sarco's company is, unlike some of the others who sort of rested on their laurels and made very similar kit with updates, they just went for innovation in a big way. They were probably supported by the Japanese government along with lots of other manufacturing, but they really went for it in a big way. And of course, they weren't the only one. It wasn't long before 2 or 3 others popped up. Trio, of course, became Kenwood, and Inui became Icon. And they were all waiting in the wings. And it didn't take them long to get going either. Without going into detail about all their products, the iconic one for me was the FT101. It came out in 1970. Not the best radio on the market. The receiver in the early ones was pretty naff, would overload, but it showed an intent that they were going to innovate and bring out radios with everything in the box. Power supply built in, microphones, all you needed to plug in, AC and DC power supply built in, sweep tubes, so quite high output, and all in one package. They reckon you could get it in the overhead locker of an airline. And it was a huge global success. It went through updates, of course. There it is inside, extremely well made. Very, very good. I know people who've had them and they've carried on working for decades and decades with hardly a problem, hardly any component failures at all. Plug-in boards make servicing and repair of these FT101 series very, very easy. So from 1970, everything built in, good quality parts. Fox Tango Club in the US started to feed back to the team. So there was some sprogs here. The receiver's not very good. It's overloading. Makes you want to look at this, look at that. In the UK, we see, can we have Top Band? And they obliged, and Top Band went on to the FT101B. The numbers are not clear, but 100,000, 200,000, absolutely gargantuan number. And of course, it lives again today as the FTDX 101D. And when you look at some of the companies, I've got some pictures of KW, but then you look at this. This is an early picture of Yaesu around that time. You look at it, it's like an aircraft hangar production line. You look at it, it just shows an intent that Drake and KW and the others just could not compete with, and in the end, of course, they didn't. The FT101s are pretty easy to restore, and we can talk about some others in a minute. But all the plug-in modules make them fairly easy to work on. Again, the problem with them is the sweep tubes in the output stage are unobtainable now, or if you do, you could pay almost as much for the two valves as you do for a whole damn radio. So that's those early FT101s. That's where their Achilles heel is. And of course, then the flood, the big three began to dominate, and HF and VHF and other companies just began to fall away. They just could not compete with this. The FT101 moved on to the FT101ZD, which I think is quite a good radio for anybody to buy, perhaps restore. Got an exceptionally good receiver, especially the later ones. Doesn't use sweep tubes. Is heavyweight, still built like a boat anchor, not plug-in boards, or not so many plug-in boards, and switches and relays and mechanical things which always fail on every old bit of electronic kit, whatever it is you've got, all need cleaning, but very reliable and good fun. You'll hear a lot of them on the bands even today. Another one, Dave's Heart. I've got two of these. Dave's got one, the FT200. I can't show all the myriad radios made from this period, but just a cheap valve radio. Very simple sweep tubes, unfortunately. Great performer on the low bands, even up to 20 meters. Very, very simple. 2 or 3 different models. They've had one of the earliest ones ever exported out of Japan. Another classic one, Trio Kenwood. Produced a whole range of radios. Really, they're all almost, except Icon, the other big companies get on this idea of having transistors where in all the key areas of the radio, except for where it generated RF, and they use valves, and it became known as a hybrid. And the FT101s, the A2s are hybrids. The Kenwoods were all hybrids from this period, which means a lot of the radio is incredibly reliable because it's solid state and components generally aren't stressed. This is a Kenwood 520, which is slightly earlier than the one I've just showed you in the picture gone by. One that I'm very familiar with. Again, Dave's got one of these, FT901, FT902 in 1977, 78. There was a shortwave mag in 78, I think it was, which showed me how the Americans have fallen behind and how the Japanese have gone ahead. Even in 1978, and the last knock-ins of Drake's valve transceivers, they were still flogging them in early 1978 before they moved to transistors. So in the shortwave mags, an old Drake valve transceiver, I love them, and then this thing, which has got everything built in, digital readout, 1 kilohertz, all bands, went to warp noise blanker, tune-up timer, proper AM, proper FM, CW filter, peak filter, you name it. The whole works in there, AC and DC operation, all in one box. Fantastic receiver, and you got the old Drake with all the valve gear. Just that one period showed that how quickly these guys had gone in front and how slow some of the companies would be to catch up. Icon did dally briefly with hybrid radios, but very quickly decided to go straight to transistors for the whole radio. This is their IC701 in 1976, 77, I think. And they bypassed the valve era altogether. And of course, they've continued to be a premier across the board, but their premier top flight kit is still incredibly highly regarded today. Because none of the others, KW never made a transistor rig. KW sold out the Decca and faded away. Drake carried on with their 7 line, which was transistorized, but they never really had the industrial capacity to catch up with the Japanese invasion. So pretty much the end of the big boat anchors. So why do we bring this old kit back to life? Well, just a few slides left now before we sign off. Well, I don't know what you might all have different views, some of you, and it is blokes, isn't it, mainly? But you know, in your formative years, everything is brand new, everything's fresh in your mind when you're a teenager, and you especially if you had no money, you just drool over everything, and that's me, mate, isn't it? But you know, back then when I was kid, wanted to be listening to people on top band. You know, I wanted a Fender Stratocaster. I've got quite a few now. Play the guitar a lot, but I couldn't afford one then. You know, I wanted a sports car. You know, dreamed of it, drawed over the books. Yeah, I wanted to play every Beatles song and be on the telly, and I wanted a Drake or a KW or anything, but I couldn't afford any of those things. So it's returned for some to teenage dreams of maybe you had time in the forces and you remember the kit that you used. Maybe you went to some of you read these magazines, you looked at it, read it again. There was no internet, of course, just read it, the same magazine over and over again. When can I ever own that? When will I be on the air talking to stations around the world? You know, look at the price there, Drake T4XB there on the left, 225 quid. That was as much as a KW transceiver. So you can see how KW were, you know, cheaper than the US, but out of reach of a schoolboy. Or I went up to London and looked in the shops, all the kit. There were quite a lot of surplus shops in London at the time, so that was a bit cheaper. But you know, it still couldn't just afford it. I didn't have £5 to rub together to walk into a shop and buy a load of surplus parts. I had to be very, very careful what I bought from the pocket money. So that's my reason for enjoying some of this kit so much. What do you need to do it? Well, you need some skills, but you need some commitment and you need some time. If you've never played with old equipment before or you've never pulled anything apart before, then it's a skill to learn. Build something simple, start with a kit. Talk to your people in your club about building something. You know, you build a simple valve stuff. You can either run some of the valves off batteries anyway, make a regen receiver out of batteries. So there is a range of skills to learn. And, you know, if you've not done it much before, and even me, I had to take it slow. I didn't know it all, but learning is fun and it never stops. Commitment's a difficult one. You know, you might get it wrong. I've got things wrong, burnt out heater wiring. But you're committed to do something or you put it away and you never touch it again. So commitment's a hard one. And but you know, don't worry if things go wrong. Take a break, come back to it. Probably the hardest one of all in these busy times, and I mean the lockdown, it's different, is time management. And I know loads of hands who've got radios in dusty corners and attics and been sticking for years, and you know they'll get around to it. You listen to people on some of the bands. Oh, I've got a KW something or other in the loft. You know, don't leave it in the loft. Take it out. It'll rot away up there. But it's a difficult one, and it's not for everybody. Obviously not. It's only for a few of us. What do you need to do it? Well, if you're just looking at HF gear, you don't actually need much kit. That's part of my workshop studio. Signal generator, a scope, a digital voltmeter. Not a great deal to do it. Another receiver to listen on is nice. I've got plenty of them. Dummy loads, so you don't wind everybody else up on the band. And where do you get this stuff from? If you want to buy any of this kit, well, sadly at the moment we've got no rallies. eBay has become sort of a place to go, but things have got very expensive, and I hate bidding, and they go for 3 or 4 times what I would pay. So the best thing is your network of friends, your radio club, your ham friends, older people as well, that might say, okay, you know, I can't get inside the stuff now. Why don't you take it on? So for me, it's all been about networking and friends to get a lot of this gear. A few adverts in Radcom have brought in some fantastic gear. Sadly, we haven't got any rallies at the moment. I like to go face to face and say, you know, can I tell me how much you want and do a deal. And I have bought stuff at rallies. Hopefully we'll have them again soon. You've got Milton Keynes rally, of course, and I've been there 2 or 3 times. But the most important thing is quality, you know, quality of what you're buying and the price, physical, electronic and physical, but you can't test it. So you have to use a bit of nous. I mean, I treat most things that I'm working as junk. And if somebody says it's rare and collectible, then I pass and say, well, flog it to somebody who wants it for that. But I've done pretty well. I'm not unreasonable about it. I'm sure you wouldn't be. Buying a fixture, well, if you think you might think about getting something, maybe only one bit of kit, the best thing to do is research. Of course, research all over the internet. You'll get good and bad information. You know, manuals are there available. Just about a manual for just about everything is available online for free. VMARS, I've got up there, I'm in VMARS, Vintage and Military Amateur Radio Society, produce a great magazine, and their website gives access to a lot of resources, but most of the big mates have got websites. KW, we've got our user group. Drake have got a big group in America. It's all available free, all the information, and the is available for nothing. Some people hate social media and forums and stuff. But the reality is, if you're going to work on some of this kit, you're going to have to dive into that swamp and talk to some of these people and read out some of the stuff. You're just going to sift it. You know, I read things in the forum, like my Drake TR4 stopped working. What could be the problem? And then somebody will post, I haven't got one, but have you tightened up all the screws and changed all the capacitors? Both things completely useless. But then the question was not really framed either. But you have to sift through it. But there is a huge amount of stuff out there. My website, I get regular mails from people. Some I get from people who say, I've got a radio and I've turned it on, but I don't understand. It's got valves in it. I mean, it's very difficult to talk people through because every fault is different. Coming to the end now, folks. I won't bore you for too much longer. I mean, the big thing about buying and fixing is, if you've got a fault on something, is to think before you start. If you've got a particular fault, more thinking than opening the box and looking in, because there will be characteristics. Every fault is different. But as you do more and more, you start to, it's all in the thinking process before you actually do anything. When you open up something you've never opened up before, the mechanical things are all going to be in a state. Switches will have oxidized. I don't even turn them on anymore. Relays will oxidize. Pots will be dirty, and the springs in the switches will fail. They will all, mechanical components will be problematic. You just have to clean them before you start. Resistors, especially in older kit, there could be 20% tolerance. So that means 100K could be 120K. So that's not out. That's fine. If it goes to the next value up and beyond, then maybe it's to change. And of course, with a lot of valve kit, you can test the resistors in circuits. You just put a DMM across and read and put it on. If it's miles out, then I would change them. These nasty capacitors, there's a whole range of capacitors. Some capacitors go on forever, like ceramic ones, but these nasty ones we've spoken about before won't. And electrolytic capacitors, the world is completely divided. You change them, you try and bring them up slowly, which is called reforming, or just take them out and put a new one in. I'm on the fence with it. I've got some that are still working after decades. There's some that have failed, and some that I just look at and think, it's got Hunts written on it, I will change it. Valves are remarkably long life. They will go on forever, not forever and ever. They will go on for a very, very long time. Conversely, these things may not go on for a very long time. Transistors will fail. They're less robust. When they're working properly, they are incredibly long life, but they can fail. And with later radios, which have got LSI chips in your synthesized radios, all the ones that have come after in the 90s, the ICOMs and the Yaesus and the many others, the more chips they've got in them, the more problematic it is for a repairer. I don't really tackle them too much, because if you've got a chip problem like that, you've got to get it out. It's a specialist job to remove it. You've got to have another one. You need to be pretty sure the fault is in there before you dive in to some of these, which is why I favour the older, simpler kit, which is what I'm is all over my website. If you're really handy with your paint can, and you can respray. I respray quite a lot. That's a KW bezel to KW case. I've got very close to period correct paint, but again, it's an art that if you don't know, you learn it. You need to undercoat, rub down, undercoat, and spray carefully. And I got it wrong loads of times before I got it right, and it still probably wouldn't pass muster if it was in a car repair shop. But boy, it looks a lot better than a rusty case. And this is one of the freest products in my shed. It's a KW2000A. Which has been fully restored. The front panel is in good condition. It's got a mark on it. They're very difficult to restore front panels. It's got some extra logos on it, but it looked in a sorry state when it came in, but that's what it looks like now. And of course, check and double check with any valve gear. It's check and double check, safety first. As one of my friends says to me, always check the DC before you do anything. In faults, and in safety. Are there any volts on there before you touch it? It's just about the number one thing, because for most of the valve kit anyway, it could knock you out, or in the worst case it could be fatal and take you an electric shock. Linears, big high voltage linears, a whole another ball game. You probably won't get a second chance if you grab hold of the EHT before it's decayed away. So check and double check safety first. So we're pretty much it's running a bit slow this, so I'll just quickly now a couple of slides. What are the pitfalls? One of the big pitfalls of buying kit is the bodger. The bodger is somebody that's had the kit before you and wasn't very good with a soldering iron, loved an electric drill, or just had a go at painting. The bodger, the problem with the bodger is that it won't be documented. You won't know what that person's done if there's wires hanging out or something. Something to be aware of. That was the inside of an FT101ZD I restored 5 years ago, and that is an AM transistor radio PC board in there. I won't bore you with what he did unless you want to know at the end, but that's what greeted me. I knew it didn't work when I bought it. And look at all those cables. I got a pile of stuff out of that radio. So bodger. Oh, and there's a relay hanging out of my Swan 500. That's a G3 did that. My God, it's terrible. So here we are at the end. What do we get out of it in the end? That's my KW2000. Well, somebody said on my last presentation, because I've done quite a lot of these now, that, you know, it's a funny thing to say that it is fun. For me, fun might not be the right word. Satisfaction, perhaps, of bringing something back to life that might have been dead. Achievement, I've learned something. I learned a bit of social history of the company, the people who used that kit back in the day, the people who designed it, the people who built it. And let's face it, SSB, AM, CW, and FM, and RTY, they haven't changed for years. And certainly some of the more stable boat anchor kit, and I use it all the time. I use my Drake gear all the time. It doesn't drift that much. It's quite adequate for talking rag chewing on 80 meters. Why do I need a 10, 5, 3,000 pound radio? My KW2000B, I use it all the time. And some of the later boat anchors, FT101s and that with their digital VFOs, they're quite adequate. So those modes haven't changed. The electronics and the physics haven't changed in rebuilding this old stuff. And they actually work quite well, and I haven't found the hidden menus on a lot of them. And it's, as I said, it's a social history of the people who used them and who made them. And as a parting shot, it's a bit like the old car, isn't it? It's a Morris 1000 there. You know, there is a massive vintage car following in this country, and you wonder why. And again, it's going back to when you had simpler times, but you can go to the shops as well in your, well, hopefully you'll get back if you go to the shops in the Morris 1000, but yeah, you can buy a brand new car and your Teslas or your Nissan Leafs or whatever they're going to be in the future. But there's something about having an old bit of equipment that you have to twiddle and tune and adjust and fettle, and maybe it's a man thing. So I equate some of this to, I haven't got any vintage cars, but I've got vintage radios. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. That is just going on to the very last slide, which is my where you can contact me. I hope you've enjoyed it. Build something. I know you've got, most clubs have got builders, and build something, maybe move on to modifying something, whatever it is. Doesn't have to be a transceiver, but a bit of hand radio kit, but buy something old and rebuild it. You get a great sense of pleasure out of it. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. That's me, G3ZPS.com, which Phil mentioned. I'm on Facebook, G3ZPS Ham Radio, VMARS, and of course I'm on YouTube as Telecaster Steve, which is half guitars and half old radios. Right, let's just stop the screen sharing, and you can go back to you, Phil.
Very good, Steve. Absolutely fascinating. Tremendous presentation. Really enjoyed that. You brought back bits of yesteryear that I hadn't seen, and we've all got stories about what we did with AR88s and HR, carrying all this stuff back really on that. Anybody got any questions for Steve? I know we've had quite a long session. Anybody got any questions for Steve this evening at all?
They're all still there. That's a good thing. They're all muted. How are you doing, Dave?
Hang on a minute. I'll just make sure everybody's unmuted.
Oh, yeah, they can't, yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I can do that at the bottom. I think there we go. So everybody should be unmuted now, if that's okay. Anybody would like a question, a question at all?
Or a comment.
Or a comment?
Wow, stunned them all into silence.
I would just like to say thank you very much. It was extremely interesting.
Cheers, Barry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, go on, Dave.
Yeah.
Can't hear you now.
Go on, Dave. You can't hear us.
Oh,
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Dave. Yeah.
I don't think you're hearing me.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
I think his microphone's
Yeah, it's not working very well.
Oh, I've got troubles with the speaker.
We can hear you, Dave.
Yeah, turn the speaker off, Dave, and just talk. Yeah, if you can.
Words to that tune.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can hear me or not.
Yes.
Yes, we can,
Yeah.
Dave. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, right, well, the microphone's coming up. Yeah, I remember G.W. Smith from last week. I used to go down there a lot. And I met Rowley Shears many times. He didn't share a picture of the first people he got. G.W. Atlanta.
Yeah.
9 years. 9 years.
Favourite radio.
Dave, we seem to be struggling now with you. Talk a little bit away from the mic. I think it's cutting out, or there's some AGC on it or something on it. But just talk a little bit further from the mic, and we can hear you, I think.
Yeah, I'm having trouble with the mic and the speaker.
That's fine now. That's fine now, Steve.
Sounds good.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just said I went down to Rowley Shears' place, KW, and I met him several times. He was the one that repaired my rig. And G.W. Smith, I got a lot of the stuff for the radio museum from down there. 39 and 6 for a 19 set. Anyway, let's say what the others got to say.
Well, my recollection of G.W. Smith was I was, brought up in London, and I went down on the tube to they were in Lisle Street, I think, really. And my dad wanted to know why I wanted to go to Soho and stuff. and he sold me an HRO, but you know how heavy the HRO is. And then all the coils came in a wooden box.
Yes, yeah.
But I couldn't carry the wooden box. So I said, okay. He said, don't worry about that. He said, come back tomorrow and you can get that box. So anyway, I carried the HRO home on the tube. And I went down the next day to go and get the wooden box, and he'd sold it to somebody else. So the HRO I had only had one coil in, which was the one it came with, and I never got hold of the rest of it.
Oh dear. I thought you might say that. One of my close friends, Ian G3ROO, who's down here in Dover, down in Kent, he's got like a GB2 SPY military like little spy radio museum. So what he used to do when he was about 13, he used to go up to one of those shops in Lisle Street, because the B2 spy sets, which Dave will know, they came in a suitcase. And apparently quite a big suitcase. And apparently what would happen is people would go into the shop and buy the suitcases. So what Ian would do as a scruffy, like 13 or 14-year-old, he'd sit on the pavement outside like poverty. And he'd say, as they came out, he'd say to the guy, is there a radio in that suitcase? And the bloke would say, yeah. And he said, well, did you want it? And they go, and a couple of times, apparently, the guy said, no, I don't really, I just want the suitcase. And he said, oh, can I have the radio then? And he ended up coming back the next day and trying this ruse, over a period. And he got 2 or 3 of these B2s because people just wanted the suitcase, not the radio in it. But God, those radios now are worth thousands.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame in some ways. It was a fantastic place. You could spend all day there looking at the stuff. It was just...
I did.
Yeah, I sold one of mine recently for £3,000.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Still got one.
Yeah.
I've got a KW2000 off of Dave about 5 years ago, and some Heathkit gear off of him, and I've bought some stuff out of your electro jumble that your club does at the when the computer museum has a sell-off of bits and bobs. I bought some bits out of that. God knows when you're going to do that again.
Well, we're hoping to do it later in the year.
Oh, I hope so, Dave. Be bad for my storage.
They had a COVID-friendly one in the summer. You know, we had those 2 months in which we could actually do things like go to the pub for till 6 o'clock or whatever. So they had one then, but hopefully they'll do it again. Any other questions for Steve at all?
No,
I'm seeing no. Well, Steve, thank you very much. I mean, that was, you know, educational and motivational talk. It was fantastic to see all that history and then how you go about restoring that stuff. And greatly admired, you know, what you've done. It's a bit difficult to sort of clap and thank you in the normal way, but
you can't, mate. Don't worry.
We'll just kind of raise our thumbs and say,
well,
thanks very much indeed. That was a really, really good talk, and thanks very much indeed.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining us.
You've got one of these. You've got one of
Steve.
these you can do. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll shoot off and get a glass now. Yeah, I'll move on. I'm a musician, and I normally touring all around the southeast.